think Ken is going to speak for a while and then have some time at the end for questions and answers and discussion. So once again, thank you for coming. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Ken Stone.
Do Bibles matter in homosexuality debates? And I just want to point out that I have intentionally not used as my title certain other questions that we could discuss. For example, I have not asked, and I do not intend to discuss, the question, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? I do have opinions about that. I'll be glad to share them in another context. That's not what we're going to talk about here. So far as the question that I am asking is concerned, you'll be glad to hear that I'm not going to hold you in suspense. The answer to the question, do Bibles matter in homosexuality debates, is yes, but. That is, yes, of course Bibles matter in homosexuality debates. We hear Bibles referred to all the time as justification for the condemnation of homosexuality, as justification for the valorization of heterosexual marriage, and implicitly at least as justification for discrimination against lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgendered and other queer persons. So yes, Bibles matter, but Bibles may not matter in quite the ways we sometimes imagine, and other things may matter as much as or more than Bibles do. So yes, but. That's the form of my answer. And everything else I'm going to say will be sort of an elaboration on that. My elaboration is going to take the form, though, of a kind of an update on research in progress. I want to tell you a little bit about some research that I've been conducting specifically during the last 9 months with the help of our program in LGBTQ studies. And I want to share a few observations that I've made out of that research, if I can see. The research is still ongoing, so my thoughts are quite preliminary. The good news is that you are now going to have a chance to be involved in that research because after I share with you a few of my observations, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss some of it together and still hopefully be done in time for everyone to get to class. Now the research in question does concern the role of biblical interpretation in contemporary debates over homosexuality, and especially the role of biblical interpretation in situations of change or transformation. My own research on homosexuality and biblical interpretation goes back a lot further than the last 9 months, as many of you know. The topic is one I was writing on long before I came to CTS. However, when biblical scholars in particular investigate matters related to homosexuality and biblical interpretation, most often those investigations take the form of variations on the question, what do the biblical texts mean? What did the biblical texts mean in the ancient world, and how do those texts have meaning for us today? And as most of you know, biblical scholars as a group actually tend to focus more on the first of those questions. What did the biblical text mean in the ancient world? And let me say clearly that I think there are good reasons for that sort of research to take place. It's not particularly easy to figure out just what the biblical text meant in the ancient world, and it's more difficult still to flesh out the range of assumptions about sex, gender, kinship, and so forth that led the biblical writers to say whatever it is that we think they may have been saying about sexual matters in their ancient context. All of that is important to figure out. I put a lot of time into it myself. But why is it important? Is it important simply for antiquarian reasons, because we hope to have a better understanding of the ancient world? Or do we imagine that research into Bible and homosexuality actually makes a difference in debates that are taking place today around homosexuality? If so, can we say what that difference is? Is it the case, for example, that people actually change their positions in such debates because they hear new interpretations of biblical texts? If not, what factors do lead people to change positions, and what role, if any, does biblical interpretation play? Well, thanks to our program in LGBTQ studies, I've been able to devote more attention to those sorts of questions over the last few months. I've actually been looking at those questions from a few different points of view, and this evening I just want to focus on one of the ways that I've been trying to get at those questions, though some of the other things I've been looking at will come up in passing as I do. One of the things I decided about a year ago was that if I was going to think about these questions in new ways, I needed to hear some additional voices. And so for at least a portion of my research time this year, I put aside the Hebrew, I powered down the computer, and I went to have some conversations. Most of those conversations were, in fact, formal taped interviews, which were heroically transcribed by Marcia Sumner, who I need to thank publicly here for her work there. There were also a few other conversations that were less formal or not taped, but importantly, these interviews and other conversations were not with biblical scholars. In fact, most of them weren't with academics at all. I do plan to follow up with some biblical scholars about these conversations, but as a professor myself, I dialogue all the time with other professors and graduate students, and there's a lot of benefit in that. I would not be teaching in a graduate institution if I didn't think there was benefit in that. But with the help of our LGBTQ Religious Studies program, I've also had a chance this year to hear some additional perspectives from pastors, religious leaders, community activists, and even in some cases just plain church folk who, for whatever reason, had found themselves engaged in situations where homosexuality and Christianity were matters of debate. These conversations took place around the country, outside of CTS, and as a result of these conversations, I've been mulling a few things over in my mind, which is what I want to share with you. But I do so with two caveats. First, I don't want to characterize these conversations as anything like ethnographic results. All right? I'm interested in ethnographic research. Some of you probably know that cultural anthropology played a role in my education, but I am by primary training and vocation a reader of texts. And I have in fact approached these interviews as texts to be interpreted, with all of the complications that arise whenever we try to interpret text that some of you get to hear me talk about in other contexts. This is important for me to note for several reasons, not the least of which is that my sample is skewed. Most of my conversation partners identified as Christian, though some did not. The majority were white, though some were not. All were from North America. And moreover, I didn't really try to talk to folks across the full spectrum of opinion about homosexuality and Christianity. I do believe there would be some value in seeing someone take that additional step, and I can say more about this. But most of my conversations were with what we might call, with some oversimplification, people from the moderate to liberal end of the theological spectrum. Even the more conservative among them had either gone through changes of mind in what we might call a queer-friendly direction, or they were themselves lesbian or gay. And that was actually important for me because I was primarily concerned with factors that seem to be at work in situations where such changes do take place. That was one of my driving questions. What role or roles does biblical interpretation, or did biblical interpretation play in situations of change? But the sample for my interviews is too skewed to be considered anything other than text to be interpreted. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is this. I'm embarrassed to say this, but it's true. Some of the observations I'm going to make are quite unremarkable. They may just seem like so much collective wisdom, all right? And that's exactly what I've been seeking, some collective wisdom, specifically from people working outside of academic contexts who have stories to share about struggle and transformation and faith. But what happens when we bring the wisdom and the stories of those people to bear on the ways in which we think about and teach biblical interpretation in the context of graduate theological education? That's what I'm still trying to think about, actually. So, with those caveats, let me make the first observation that may be the most obvious one of all, but it nevertheless bears repeating, and that is that, of course, no two people involved in homosexuality debates have exactly the same experiences with either Christianity or biblical interpretation. These experiences are inflected by differences in theological perspective, in denominational structure and ethos, differences in age, in race, in gender, and so forth. And even apart from these more commonly talked about differences, one discovers from paying attention to stories that people tell that our individual lives often stand in interesting kinds of tension with the larger, more generalizing categories that we use to talk about our world, and that we use in such situations as the homosexuality debates. And not surprisingly, quite a few of my conversation partners were very eager to make the point, and rightly so, that when folks argue over homosexuality and biblical interpretation, they're not simply arguing over the interpretation of specific verses. They're just as often, and perhaps more often, arguing over different ways of understanding what Bibles are and how they ought to be used. And in fact, my conversations in this project actually strengthen my own conviction, which I have been reaching for a number of other reasons, that it may not be helpful for us to talk about the Bible as a singular thing with a definite article. You may even have noticed that I used the term Bibles in my title for tonight, and I can say more about that if you wish. It's something that I've actually just finished writing about in an article called Bibles That Matter. Some of you may hear a little Judith Butler in there, and that's intentionally so. The point here is simply that we come at homosexuality debates from many different starting points, including a lot of different starting points about what Bibles are and how they function. And the differences that one encounters in the stories that individuals tell about their experiences complicate any attempt to listen to those stories and draw conclusions about the ways in which positions that people take on homosexuality are actually changed or transformed. Change and transformation do happen, but the paths leading to change and transformation are seldom uniform. They are, in a lot of ways, diverse. So that's important to acknowledge. Nevertheless, certain recurring themes did emerge often enough in the conversations that I had that I'm willing to offer at least a couple of generalizations. And the first generalization is actually a negative one. That is, it's a generalization about what seems not to occur very often. And here it is. At least from my conversations, it seems that biblical interpretation is seldom in itself a primary cause for someone's change of mind or change of perspective on homosexuality and Christianity. As much as it pains me to say this, as a biblical scholar, I haven't heard many stories about people holding anti-gay views who then read scholarly books on Bible and homosexuality, saw in those books new interpretations of biblical text, and then changed their minds about homosexuality primarily because of those new interpretations. Such books and articles can play an important role as supports for change, and I'll say more about that, but they seem not to be a major stimulus to change. They can play roles as supports for change, but they seem not to be a major stimulus to change. This is something that I don't think we say out loud nearly enough. And moreover, although I spoke with quite a few people who have been involved in real debates about homosexuality and Christianity, and although it was clear that biblical texts often came up in those debates, nevertheless, it seems to be a rare occurrence for people to change their minds about the morality of homosexuality because they heard a new interpretation of a biblical text in a debate. In fact, most of the folks I spoke with, maybe I should say many of them, were explicit about the fact that they usually avoid what one of them called the muck of the biblical debates. That is, debates over the meaning of this or that text. This was not uniformly true, but it was frequently true. Such instances of dueling exegesis, as another one of my conversation partners called it, seemed in most cases not to be considered very productive. And there may be a good reason for this. A sociologist named Don Moon has actually done some ethnographic research on congregations wrestling with homosexuality. And on the basis of that research, Moon suggests that since most Christians read Scripture in the light of what they already believe about God and life, it is very difficult. Moon actually uses the word impossible for Christians to accept something on the basis of a scriptural interpretation that seems not to make sense in terms of what Moon calls our everyday theologies. As Moon sees it, everyday theologies are what get formed in communities and are grounded in experience. And they help us to make sense out of life. They're not what you write in theology classes usually. They're what you're already working with. And Scripture plays a role in everyday theologies, but Scripture itself is read and understood in terms of everyday theology. So people can know perfectly well that alternative interpretations are out there and not be persuaded at all to change their mind about something like homosexuality because their own interpretations of Scripture are so thoroughly shaped by and help to shape in turn their everyday theologies. And this was true, incidentally, in Moon's study for both the anti-gay and the more pro-gay congregations that she looked at. But if that's true, how do people come to change their minds about homosexuality and Christianity? Because people do change their minds. How does it happen? Well, around this question, my conversations generated two related but fairly consistent themes. When people do change their views on homosexuality in a more gay-friendly direction, this process of change seems to begin in most cases either because the persons who undergo change find out that someone they know is lesbian or gay, or because they find that they are struggling with same-sex attraction themselves. Let me repeat that. The process of change seems to begin in most cases either because the persons who undergo change find out that someone they know is lesbian or gay, or because they find out that they're struggling with same-sex attraction themselves. I'll come back to the latter situation in a moment, but I want to emphasize the former. It's always dangerous to look for a single cause to any event, but when it comes to weighing various causal factors that may be at work in those situations where someone who is not gay changes their perspective in a more gay-friendly direction, it seems pretty clear from my conversations that relationships are more powerful than exegesis. This was true both in the self-reports from straight allies who were trying to account for changes in their own perspective, and in the stories told by both straight and gay folk who had seen change happen in the perspectives of others. There were narratives involving the discovery that a good friend, for example, or a child or some other close person was lesbian or gay. But interestingly enough, the discovery didn't always involve that kind of close or long-term relationship. Professional relationships, for example, were also referred to, or situations in which another church member turned out to be lesbian or gay. Now, the mere fact of finding out that someone you know is lesbian or gay does not by any means guarantee conversion to a gay advocacy position. In fact, I also heard during these conversations, and I've heard on many occasions before, counter-narratives in which the discovery that a child or a sibling, for example, was gay or lesbian actually produced a lot of conflict and a lot of alienation. And one of the pastors I spoke with talked with a great deal of pain about the conflict that erupted in his church when a gay couple began attending. So my point is not that meeting or discovering that one already knew lesbians or gay men inevitably leads to transformation in the direction of tolerance or pro-gay advocacy, because often it doesn't. Often it doesn't. The point is that when such transformation in the direction of tolerance or pro-gay advocacy does happen, and it does happen, the discovery that an acquaintance or loved one was lesbian or gay is very often cited in the stories told as having played a major role in setting such transformation in action. Certainly that sort of discovery seemed to be more memorable for the folks I talked with than the encounter with an alternative biblical interpretation. However, and this is important, The search for alternative biblical interpretations does sometimes follow from the discovery that someone you know is lesbian or gay. Here's a new experience. One didn't know that this loved one or that acquaintance was lesbian or gay. One didn't realize that someone like this could be lesbian or gay. Here's a potential contradiction to the views that one had about lesbians and gay men. As Moon would probably put it, one has to see if this experience can make sense. Or to cast the language in a little more active mode, one has to make sense out of the new experience and out of the new knowledge. And depending upon the views that one has already about Scripture, having access to other ways of reading biblical text or other ways of thinking about biblical interpretation can be incredibly important at that point. One of my conversation partners was a straight pastor who became an advocate for lesbians and gay men after a parishioner came out to him, and he subsequently walked through similar processes with other straight Christians. And he spoke quite passionately about this when I interviewed him. And I want to quote a few sentences from his interview in particular, because I think it captures very well what several other folks tried to communicate with me. This is, quote, experience is really what opens the door for people to begin to look at things in new ways. Where there's conflict, when there's incongruity between what someone experiences and what they have believed and the authority that they use to base their beliefs on, when there is that conflict and the heart really is wanting, the heart is already connected to this experience, and so the mind needs to follow. That's when people are open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. That's beautiful. The heart really wants. The heart is connected to. The mind needs to follow. But he also noted, and here he's talking about a specific case, a woman who found out that her neighbors were gay. Quoting again, the mind resists because it's still hanging on to these old concepts and old arguments and reasoning. They have to somehow resolve and reconcile these old beliefs with this experience. Then people are open to looking at some new possibilities. And so I think what I offered to this woman was a way of affirming the Bible. It's not that suddenly the Bible is wrong here. Our understanding of the Bible has changed, and we see things in a new light. And so she was certainly not going to discard the Bible, but she needed to understand it in a new way, and that's what happened. End of quote. So this is one of the points where Bibles matter, and where resources on biblical interpretation and homosexuality matter. The heart is seeking. Somebody or has gotten the heart connected to the question, as this guy put it, but the mind needs to follow. Biblical scholarship, I'm sorry to say, probably usually doesn't get the heart connected. Biblical scholarship is not really set up to make the heart want, as he said. But biblical interpretation can help the mind to follow once the heart is ready to lead. And similarly, the realization that one is oneself, lesbian, gay, or bisexual, can initiate a process in which it becomes important to have access to alternative ways of thinking about biblical interpretation. Some of my conversation partners spoke quite passionately about this, naming specific books that were crucial in the process by which they came to accept themselves. However, in my conversations, there were some striking variations around just this point. That is, some folks, upon realizing that they were themselves lesbian or gay, did find it vital to work through the question of how to understand biblical references to homosexuality. Some of them were explicit about needing to know that inasmuch as they were Christian, it was okay to be lesbian or gay. But others talked about this in something like the opposite way. That is, it was also important for them to reconcile Christianity and homosexuality, but once they realized they were gay, it wasn't homosexuality that was on trial. It was Christianity that needed to be justified. Could Christianity live up to the challenge of being articulated in a gay-friendly way? In either case, though, the question of biblical interpretation often came in at this point, as it did for so-called straight folk who were trying to find a way to let their mind follow their heart. So, biblical interpretation may not always be a cause of queer-friendly change, but it can be a crucial support for such change. There's a related phenomenon to talk about here, though. Sometimes change happens not simply because a person finds out that someone they know or have met is lesbian or gay, but in the context of what one of my conversation partners who was lesbian called, quote, a personal testimony about my faith and my reconciliation of my sexual identity with the life of my faith. I want to underscore this reference to personal testimony. This particular woman had an MDiv and several kinds of ministerial experience, but she didn't have a lot of confidence in what she called arguing on the scriptures. That is, arguing over the interpretation of this or that verse. She did believe that biblical interpretation was important, but she felt that progressive Christians actually needed to work harder at articulating interpretations of Scripture with what she called a personal testimony about Scripture. She seemed to feel that testimony, in her words, was harder to dismiss than a competing biblical interpretation of specific verses. And this argument on behalf of testimony about Scripture, it resonated with suggestions that other people made to me as well. Here's how another United Methodist minister put it when asked about situations in which he had seen people change their minds about homosexuality. Quote, they've made friends with someone who's gay or lesbian, or they've heard the testimony of someone who's gay or lesbian, and whose testimony resonated with the vocabulary of their faith. It's not sort of an ideological argument, it's seeing your narrative in the narratives of Scripture, end quote. Now notice here not only the recurrence of this emphasis on testimony, which is a word I may want us to talk about a little further, but also a conjunction between the importance of meeting someone who was lesbian or gay and the ability to make interpersonal connections specifically around vocabularies of faith. Some similar emphases came up in my conversation with a lesbian minister who suggested that her straight ministerial peers were more likely to remain in dialogue with her, not because of the ways in which she read texts that may or may not refer to homosexuality, but rather because she was able to talk with them about their shared struggles as ministers with the task of finding meaning in Scripture. Precisely because as ministers, they were committed to reading Bibles as resources, they found themselves wrestling with difficulties in the text. And it was in shared conversations around this, conversations between straight and gay ministers, that the straight ministers were exposed to what my conversation partner called, quote, a devotional, appreciative posture about the Scripture that they recognize, end quote. And for my conversation partner, this was just as important to breaking down stereotypes as other sorts of stereotypes of lesbians and gay men that are shattered through personal encounter. Now, notice, this is very important to say in this context, that by using the phrase devotional appreciative posture about the Scripture, this woman was not talking about uncritical acceptance of just anything and everything that can be backed up by quoting a biblical text. Her point was explicitly about the ways in which many ministers have to wrestle weekly with biblical texts that are, for whatever reason, troubling. The idea seemed to be, however, that ministers wrestle with Scripture because of an overall devotional stance toward it. And it was in the recognition of this shared stance that a straight minister who was actually quite conservative was able to make a connection with this lesbian minister. This shattered the stereotype of what she called the gay Christian who has thrown the Bible out. A stereotype that in her view was a stumbling block, as she put it, to connection and encounter. Now, of course, there are a lot of reasons why people might want to throw Bibles out. And nearly all of my conversation partners were willing to talk bluntly about this, not only in terms of queer issues, but also, for example, in relation to slavery, in relation to positions of women, and so forth. And specifically around questions of homosexuality, everyone I spoke with was clear about the fact that Bibles are not only supports for change, Bibles are often appealed to as obstacles to change. In fact, several of my conversation partners noted that in situations where change seems like a possibility, where some amount of change is already underway, Bibles are often appealed to precisely to shut down dialogue. Bibles aren't really brought up in a lot of cases because folks think, oh, we can have a sincere dialogue over the text. Instead, they're used almost like trump cards. Here, we can't go any further. The Bible's in our way. Sorry. You know, it was that sort of thing. In fact, one activist gave a specific instance in which some representatives from Focus on the Family said, Your political arguments are compelling. We wish we could accept it, because they're logical, but the Bible just won't let us go to that conclusion. So the Bible's kind of a pull-in support for stopping dialogue at that point. And so there was never any question about the fact that biblical text could be a problem. And one gay minister and activist who came originally out of a very fundamentalist background spoke about literally wrapping up his Bible and putting it away for a while. Actually, his exact words were shoving it into a cabinet and not going back to it. It took him a while to get beyond that. And another activist who didn't really identify very strongly with any religious tradition probably spoke for a lot of other people when he ventured the opinion that if the Bible, quote, didn't exist, then people might have a better opportunity to talk, end quote. And who knows, I might have heard a lot more such statements if folks hadn't known that I was a seminary Bible professor, or if I had been more intentional about talking to larger number of people who didn't identify with Christianity. But at least in my conversations, while the recognition of difficulties in Scripture was always clear, that recognition was in most cases also articulated with commitments to finding meaning in Scripture. And it seems like people are actually able to maneuver that balancing act. And we may tend to think in terms of binary divisions between uncritical acceptance of the Bible on one side and throwing Bibles out on the other side. But in the midst of homosexuality debates, lots of people are finding ways of living in those spaces in between. And so, for example, one gay UCC minister spoke quite openly to me about his aversion to preaching, for example, on the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. And his words were, "I'm sorry, I cannot wrap myself around this story." All right? And yet, he also testified to preaching from lectionary passages nearly every week, partly because of his love for story. And he acknowledged that he would quit preaching from lectionary passages when he wasn't able any longer to get meaning out of them. But so far in 15 years of preaching, that hadn't happened. And he insisted upon the importance, as he put it, of rescuing the Bible from the crap that's been done to it. In elegant wording. So far from wishing for a world where Bibles were irrelevant across the board and weren't going to be read anymore, many of the folks I spoke with seemed to long for a scenario in which, as another gay minister put it, liberals would open up the Bible more and let it work on their lives. Those kind of statements were made by quite a number of my conversation partners, and they didn't at all seem to be made out of any sort of crass political opportunism. They did seem, however, to be undergirded by a kind of recognition that it can be, as one lesbian Baptist minister put it, disarming for the more conservative Christian, quote, to find themselves in the presence of someone who may have had a hard time with Scripture, may still suffer when they read Scripture, but is not willing to or is no longer in a place of naming the Scripture as blanket enemy, end quote. Well, now there's a lot more I could report from these various conversations. I've got pages and pages of transcripts, as Marcia knows. I think what I'd actually prefer to do is wind down my own yakking here and see whether you all have some questions or observations sparked by all of this. But just before I do that, let me just come back to my title, Do Bibles Matter in Homosexuality Debates? Notwithstanding the fact that I chose that title, while reflecting, one of the things I've been thinking about while reflecting on these issues is how many problems we may create for ourselves by so quickly turning questions about homosexuality and Christianity into a debate and then trying to figure out how best to win it. We live in a culture of hardball and crossfire, and we're in a season where there's a lot of emphasis just now on presidential debates that are in fact mostly sound bites, not dialogues, not conversations. And a lot of times I think that's how homosexuality debates get set up, even in churches. There's this point, and then there's the counterpoint. And people may not think about hardball as their models, but a lot of times that's what the rhetoric about hearing both sides amounts to. It assumes two sides in opposition to one another, and each side wants to win. All right? Now, if we're really honest about it, I don't think a lot of people change their minds based on something they saw on hardball. All right? I think people watch shows like Hardball, which I confess I do, for the same reason they watch boxing matches or dog fights. They already know who they're pulling for. They already know who they're pulling for. They just want to see who can win, who can have the better fight. And if we think about Bibles in terms of debates, I'm worried that that's how we're likely to think about biblical interpretation, as a tool to help us win. I think a lot of people do see the Bible that way. I don't myself believe that Bibles do their best work in those kinds of situations. It seems to me that my interlocutors were onto something when they suggested that Bibles are best read in the context of some kind of testimony. This actually coheres well with the forms of discourse that we find in the biblical texts themselves. The biblical texts are languages of testimony in most instances. And testimony asks you, what does it ask you to do? First of all, to listen and to share, not to win. Something may follow from the listening and the sharing, but it's the listening and sharing that seems to me to be primary. So I think I will actually stop there and see if you have any questions or comments. As any of you who've been in class with me know, there's a risk that anything you say or do will set me off in another direction, but still, I'll stop there for the moment. Questions, comments? Yes?
I